We're going to be in Acts 26. Acts 26. And a lot of what we're going to see in this chapter, we've already seen at least once, some of it twice. So we're not going to spend as much time going over it. I try to leave a little bit of time for Jared to present his, and don't want to handcuff him at all on timing. So we're going to just start in 26:1. And the situation, Paul has been incarcerated there at Caesarea Maritima, Herod's palace, for over 2 years. Felix wouldn't set him free without a good bribe, so he's just stuck. When Festus comes in as governor, he gets a hearing again, and nothing is done. So he's still there. He could have, would have, should have been set free because there were no good charges against him. But when offered the opportunity to go back to Jerusalem to stand trial, he would not accept the change of venue because he knew the Jews were trying to kill him in Jerusalem. So he doesn't want to go there. So he appeals to Caesar, which is basically appealing to the Supreme Court, and he had that right. And after he does that, he really doesn't have the right to take it back. So now he's going to appear in front of Herod Agrippa, and having done so, he probably would have been set free, but he's already made his decision. So this is kind of an exercise in futility to a degree, but he gets an opportunity to speak in front of the king. And if you remember, when Paul was in Jerusalem, he had a vision when he was first arrested, and he was told, I still want you to speak in front of kings and dignitaries. So these are some of the guys that he gets to speak to on behalf of Jesus while he's incarcerated. All right, chapter 26, verse 1. Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jewish people all know the way that I lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They've known me for a long time and can testify, if they're willing, that I conformed to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God promised our ancestors that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they are earnestly serving God day and night. King Agrippa, it's because of this hope that these Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? So there's our theme. Every time Paul gives a speech, he's going to get to resurrection from the dead just as quickly as he possibly can. And he says that all the Jews have the same hope. That's not necessarily the case. The Sadducees were less interested, if interested at all, in the idea of resurrection from the dead. But in Paul's mind, the hope of the Jewish people was that Messiah would come, and through Messiah would come resurrection from the dead. So again, he brings that up as quickly as he can get to it. That's his cornerstone of his doctrine, and he's going to bring it up everywhere he goes. Verse 9, I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the Lord's people in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished. I tried to force them to blaspheme. I was so obsessed with persecuting them that I even hunted them down in foreign cities. Now, we know of at least one who was martyred while Paul was around. At the beginning of chapter 9, we're told that Paul, or Saul, as he was known at the time, was holding the cloaks of those who were stoning Stephen. So we know at least one occasion, but Paul here is speaking in the plural. right? He got lots of people and put them in jail, and then at least more than one, when they were being killed, I gave my vote against them. So at some point, he has enough authority that he's able to cast a vote for life or death concerning these prisoners that they considered to be blaspheming against God because they said that Jesus was God. So his accusation in front of the Sanhedrin when Jesus was tried was blasphemy because he made himself equal with God. And then Paul comes along and Paul is preaching, the other Christians are preaching that Jesus is God in the flesh. Paul considers that to be blasphemy. So as long as he was, before his intervention by Christ, before he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, he just thinks they're all a bunch of blasphemers, and he's willing for them to die for the crime of blasphemy. But as far as names, we only have Stephen. We only know that he was the one. Now, this is not Rome. This is the Jews. Later on, the Romans will kill a bunch of Christians because they refuse to worship Caesar. But at this point, it's a charge of blasphemy among the Jews. And for some reason, at this point in time, the Jews are able to put people to death. When Jesus was killed, they didn't have the right to execution. So something has shifted between the time that Jesus died and the time that they killed Stephen, and then on into that future time, because Paul is traveling from place to place and dragging people back to Jerusalem and throwing them in jail. Right? Do verse 12. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I asked, Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you're persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see from me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So this is the third time that we've had an account of Paul's interaction with Jesus on the road to Damascus. The first one is in chapter 9, and it's Luke telling the story, right? So Luke's writing the history of the beginnings of the church, and he talks about Saul going to Damascus. He talks about the interaction between Saul and Jesus. One of the things that's different in this account is that in this account there's no Ananias. Did you notice that? Paul just says, the voice told me I've got work for you to do. In 9, Luke tells us about the voice saying, you go on in to Damascus and it will be told you what you need to do. And so he goes to Damascus. God sends Ananias. Ananias tells him what to do. Here, he skips that. These guys don't need to know about Ananias. There's no need to include that chapter of the story in what's going on here. So he just says, I heard the voice told me what I needed to do, and he just moves on with the account. The other thing that's interesting in this one is it's the only place that we find out how the communication took place. If you met people that say, well, I heard the voice of God, well, did the voice of God speak to you in English? Did he speak to you in, Hungarian? How did, some of them will say, well, there was no voice, it was just, language in my head, right? Paul tells us how he communicated with Jesus. Jesus shows up and speaks to him in Aramaic. What is Aramaic?
The Jewish.
Yeah, that's what the Jews spoke. If you write it down, it's Hebrew. If you speak it, that vernacular was known as Aramaic. And that's what Jesus and his disciples spoke to each other all day, every day. So when Jesus speaks to Paul, he speaks to him in a language that both of them would have spoken if they'd have met in the middle of the street in Jerusalem. I just find it interesting that he doesn't speak Greek to him, and there's no Latin going on. It's just Jesus and Paul having a conversation in their native language. But again, we get Aramaic, but we get no Ananias in this particular telling of the story. Do you remember where the other one is? You've got chapter 9, Luke tells it, and then where's the next time? Saul's on the porch of the fortress Antonia, and he tells everybody to be quiet, and he tells his story to them, this mob that was trying to kill him. He recounts to them how he met the Lord. He does fine in that speech until he tells them that the Lord told him to go talk to the Gentiles. And then, they were ready to kill him again. But all of these things were done, according to Paul, so that he could help people move from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to the power of God, so that they might receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So that's his marching orders. Now we get into kind of a famous passage with King Agrippa here. Verse 19 begins, and we're going to get a response from Governor Festus, and then we're going to get a response from King Agrippa. Neither one of them are convinced by Paul's arguments. Both of them have something to say in response, and Paul has to deal with those negative responses. So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. First to those in Damascus, then to those in Jerusalem and in all Judea, and then to the Gentiles, I preached that they should repent and turn to God and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. This is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God has helped me to this very day. So I stand here and testify to small and great alike. I'm saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that the Messiah would suffer, and at the first rise from the dead would bring the message of light to his own people and to the Gentiles. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. You are out of your mind, Paul, he shouted. Your great learning is driving you insane. It's a little bit insulting. It's a lot off-putting. But at the same time, Festus has an opinion of Paul that comes through here. What's Festus' opinion of Paul? Paul's a brilliant guy, right? He's well educated. Your much learning has driven you crazy. So he kind of sees Paul as like the nutty professor, right? You just know too much and you've lost touch with reality. So as Paul is trying to convince him about resurrection from the dead and about the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, Festus just, blocks it all by saying, well, you're nuts. That's a good defense if you don't want to know something. Just say, oh, they're crazy. Then you don't have to deal with it anymore. You don't have to try to figure it out. You don't have to understand what you don't understand. Just say they're crazy and move on. So that's Festus' response to the thing. Paul answers, I'm not insane. Most excellent, Festus. What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Right, so he deflects Festus, kind of sets him to the side. He calls on Agrippa, who's the king and whose palace they're sitting in. Right? He says, forget you, Festus. I'm not nuts. Let me talk to the king. So he addresses the king and just kind of sets Festus aside. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. So it's interesting to know that Paul sees Agrippa, at least to some degree, as a believer in the Old Testament. He's at least educated in the prophets of the Old Testament. So Agrippa, I know that you know that the stuff I'm talking about is real. You're familiar with the prophecies. Isaiah talked about Jesus a lot, and Agrippa would have been familiar with those things. He was at least educated enough in the Jewish religion as their king that he would have known what Paul was talking about. So Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? Does anybody remember the old King James? I've forgotten the phrase. But anyway, it's similar, but sounds slightly different. But in such a short time, you can persuade me to be a Christian. We got a song in the songbook that we sing, almost persuaded, now to believe, almost persuaded, Christ to receive. Seems now some soul to say, go Spirit, go thy way. Some more convenient day on thee I'll call. So here's Agrippa. Not now. It's too soon. I can't make this decision so quickly. Do you really think that you can convince me so quickly to be a Christian? And of course, Paul's response to him is, well, I wish. He says, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. Then the king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice, and those sitting along with them. After they left the room, they began saying to one another, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. But none of these guys are bold enough to say, well, let's just let him go, right? Caesar knows nothing about Paul. Caesar's never heard of him. He's never gotten a letter about him. In fact, next week we'll look at the letter that they send to Caesar to try to convince, here's this guy, and we don't see anything wrong with him, but he appealed to you, so we sent him to you. Caesar would have never known that Festus let him free, right? Just tell the guards, tell Paul, pack up your stuff, go home. Paul leaves. Nobody cares. But if Caesar finds out that you let a Roman citizen who had appealed to his judgment seat go, then all your money goes away and all of your influence goes away, and you don't get to live at the palace by the ocean anymore. So these guys were smart enough to play by the rules, and they're not about to just set Paul free. So he's stuck. And again, you go all the way back. He told them when he was gathering up the funds, I could send somebody else to Jerusalem with the funds, or maybe I'll go myself. He should have just sent somebody else with the funds. When he was in Jerusalem, he could have kept a lower profile. He didn't. When he gets sent to Caesarea, he could have just fought the case. He could have stayed there. He could have done a lot of things. But eventually, he appeals to Caesar, and that costs him more time in jail and a horrible voyage that we'll be looking at in the next 2 or 3 chapters. You just take a quick look. We're in 26, and we've only got 2 more chapters to finish this thing out, right? So it's one of those, like if you're watching the movie and the movie's been going on and on and on and on, and you look at the time bar, and you go, they've only got 10 minutes to finish this up, So Luke is going to get us to Rome in a big hurry, and then he just stops. So you've got Luke, the Gospel, is volume 1. Acts is volume 2. And we needed a volume 3. And Luke never wrote volume 3 to tell us what happens with Paul after he's in jail in Rome, when they let him go the first time, and he goes back out and does more ministry. We just, we've got folklore and we've got historians, but we don't have Luke to tell us the rest of that story that would come up. I want to look at one more thing. Paul says, a short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today might become what I am, except for these chains. How would Paul describe who he was? I want you to be what I am, except for these chains. What phrases would he have used to describe who he was?
As Jesus' servant.
Okay, servant of Jesus.
Well said.
She said it first.
Okay. Great minds think alike.
There you go. What else? Think about some of the things that they've been called in Acts by friend and foe. He was a follower of the way, right? So we've got that one. The Jews accused him of being a ringleader of that sect of the Nazarenes. So he had that title applied to him. And when he was in Antioch, they were the first ones to be called Christians. Right back in chapter 11, Paul and Barnabas are working there. It's right before they go on their first missionary journey. And it says the disciples, well, there's another one. He would have called himself a disciple. But the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. So while he's in Antioch, that name is applied. And there's a lot of debate over whether the term Christian is something that they adopted for themselves or whether it was something that other people applied to them. Like that sect of the Nazarenes, you know, it's accurate, but maybe not what the Christians called themselves. I read something today about the way people identified themselves when they were in the army, that if you were in, Bob's regiment, we're Bobians, we serve under Bob. So when you are a Christian, you serve under Christ. It's as if Christ is the commanding officer. So he made a connection between the name of the commander and the troops that followed him. So he said, well, maybe people referred to them that way because of that. We don't have the word Christian in the New Testament very often. It's just not we've got it here. Agrippa's familiar with it, obviously. Do you think that so quickly you can convince me to be one, to be a Christian? In 11, the disciples were called Christians. That's it for Acts. We get the way that is the most disciples. We get that word quite a bit all the way through the New Testament. Look at 1 Peter 4. 1 Peter 4 is kind of the last one of these. You just don't see that term applied very often. Let me see where it is. Verse 15. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. Right? So even if somebody else was applying it to them, Peter says you count it as a compliment to carry that name, to be a Christian. You don't see his earthly name used as much, like followers of Jesus. You don't see that very much. You see either Christ, Messiah, or Christian, but not necessarily a follower of Jesus, the name itself. So it's interesting how they would have referred to themselves. And I'm not sure what Paul would have used. If you had said, Paul, can you describe to us what your faith is, what your religion is? I'm sure he would have said, well, I follow Jesus the Christ, or something like that. But he didn't have a name. We've always got a name, right? What group do you worship with? Well, I attend the Church of Christ. So we've got a name to describe ourselves. I'm just not sure what Paul would have used to describe what it was he wanted them to be. I wish all of you were just like me, except for these chains. So anyway, I find it interesting. Any other thoughts on any of that?